The following program is a special presentation of the Big Ten Network, produced in association with the University of Wisconsin.
80% of the world's population lives in areas where the primary freshwater source is under severe attack. Assault that comes from destruction of natural wetlands, agricultural runoff, and chemical and human pollution. These factors and others threaten the health of our lakes, rivers, and the aquatic species that live in them. How do we deal with this pending disaster? Can we reverse the trends? Find out next, during Office Hours. Hi, I'm Ken Goldstein, Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Water is obviously an essential component of life, but due to human interference, the world's rivers and lakes are in crisis. I am joined by Peter McIntyre, Assistant Professor at the Center for Limnology at UW-Madison. He is a co-author of an article published in the international science journal Nature that presents a worldwide survey of our planet's freshwater ecosystems. The article is the first to comprehensively consider biodiversity as well as human water security. Peter is part of the McIntyre Group, a research team which studies ecology and conservation at the level of the organism. Welcome to Office Hours, Pete. Appreciate you coming by. Take me, if you would, through the main findings. 80% of people in the world, water that has some issues. What does that mean?
So, well, as you said in your intro, Ken, water is the most essential resource for life. And so what our team did was to assess the variety of threats to freshwaters around the world, and what we found was a fairly scary picture. So we did that assessment from the perspective, excuse me, of biodiversity and also from a human water security standpoint. And of course, most of us are especially interested in the human water security perspective, and the key finding was that 80% of human population, this is around the world, so not just the US or Wisconsin, but worldwide, 80% of the world's population is in areas where the rivers are highly threatened. And by that, we just mean that there are many different stressors that are degrading those river systems.
So tell me a little more about what you mean by they're threatened, and what are those stressors?
Right, so we looked at 23 different stressors, and essentially what you can think of having a global map, the kind of thing you'd see in National Geographic magazine. So you've got a global map of nitrogen loading, so that's a nutrient that causes algae to grow too fast. That has all kinds of knock-on effects, oxygen depletion, that kind of thing. So that's just one of 23 different things that we consider. They include overfishing, they include damming of rivers, wide variety of things. We put all of that information together, and you produce one global map that reflects the total threat or the cumulative threat to river systems from the biodiversity perspective or from the human perspective.
So in a little bit, we're going to take a look at some of those maps.
Yeah.
But tell me how you go about doing this, where you talk about mapping freshwater sources around the entire world on 23 different stressors. It's quite an ambitious project.
Well, it took us 2.5 years, and so we were a team of researchers from 4 continents. A total of 10 of us were really deeply involved in this. And it was ambitious. One of the things that sets our study apart from earlier studies, because we're not at all the first to think about on a global scale what's the condition of water resources, but what really set our work apart is the spatial resolution. So we're looking worldwide, but you can break the world up into little, we call them grid cells. So if you just imagine laying a grid across the whole world, and that's 50 by 50 kilometers, or that corresponds roughly to 30 by 30 miles. So the entire world's broken down into these little chunks, and for each of those little chunks, we've characterized each of the 23 stressors, and then you're just summing across those to get the total level of stress.
So how many different chunks are there in the world of about, what, 900 square miles?
46,500 and change.
46,500 change. So yeah. I assume you didn't divvy that up, and each of you went to about 5,000 chunks.
We did
how
not.
Did you?
So a lot of this data comes from remote sensing, from satellite imagery. A lot of we're standing on the shoulders of giants, as the saying goes, in that all of these threat layers, or almost all the threat layers, had been developed by independent research teams who are really expert in that particular area. And so our team's mission was to pull this together and synthesize it into the total threat perspective. So there's a wide variety of sources. Some of it's rooted in on-the-ground information. Of course, there is almost nothing where somebody's literally gone to all 46,000 sites and tallied up the stress scores. So there's extrapolation involved from places we know well to places we don't know well.
So there's different scientists who have different areas of expertise.
Yes.
One might have been doing fish, one might have been doing agricultural runoff, one might have been doing you fill in the blank.
Exactly.
And they each would have been their own individual study. You're bringing that all together and then mapping it.
Precisely. So we developed a couple of the stressor layers ourselves, and so I happen to work on fish, and one of the ones that we did develop was a global freshwater fishing pressure layer. But that's one of the few that we actually developed from scratch. Usually we're relying on experts in particular subject areas.
And in our next segment, we're going to look at some of these maps. But,
Yeah.
you know, not to sound like, the geek that I am, but that's pretty interesting because all of these 23 are obviously interconnected. So it's easy for me to say, but seems to make perfect sense to go combine them all.
Absolutely. And so we did actually look at the what we would call the spatial correlations, or how closely associated are different stressors on a global basis. So if you have a high level of nitrogen loading, do you also have a high level of fishing, for instance? And many of the stressors are actually almost uncorrelated on a global basis, but particularly the ones related to chemical pollution, those typically are closely aligned. So an area that gets a lot of nitrogen pollution also has a lot of mercury deposition, et cetera.
Great. So we're going to go, and when we come back from this break, we're going to look at one of those maps that you created. So please stay with us on Office Hours. We're with Jeff McIntyre talking about the health of the world. Excuse me, we are here with Peter McIntyre, and we are talking about the health of the world's rivers and lakes. Please stay with us.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to program@uc.wisc.edu.
Where others saw lumber, we recognized a treasure. Where others saw the night, we chose the stars. Where others saw pieces, we unlocked the puzzle that could mean the end of paralysis and cancer. Since 1848, thinkers and achievers at Wisconsin have fearlessly sought ideas that transform the world. Keep on, Wisconsin. Keep on.
Welcome back to Office Hours. I'm Ken Goldstein, and I'm here with Peter McIntyre talking about the health of the world's lakes and rivers. So, Peter, you put all this information together, and reading the journal article, one of the very powerful things is when one sees it graphically. So these 45,000 grids of about 900 square miles, you then mapped on them the different stressors.
Exactly.
So we have now up something that talks about the biodiversity threat. So I see various different colors there. Take me through what we're seeing, what our viewers are seeing.
Sure, Ken. So we made a whole set of these maps, and so it's really important to understand what the colors mean. So this is from a cool to a warm scale. So blue means that you have low threat, and red means that you have high threat, and it's just a continuous scale from low to high. So when you look at the United States, most of what you see is red, the same for Western Europe, the same for the Indian subcontinent, and for East Asia there. So those are the areas of the world where threats to riverine biodiversity are highest. And I want to emphasize this is just from the river perspective, so we didn't account for groundwaters or lakes or wetlands. So you can see then at the poles, and particularly at high latitudes in the north, so we're talking about northern Asia, we're talking about northern Canada, Greenland. Those areas actually have very low threat levels. And the scale is all relative. It's sort of like when your daughter or son takes the SAT and you're in the 90th percentile, that means 10% of the kids did better and 90% did worse. So this is on a percentile basis as well. So if you're blue, you're in the lowest threat, 10 or 15%. If you're red, you're in the highest threat, 15 or 20%.
So what exactly does biodiversity threat mean? Which of the threats is that, or which of the stressors is that?
So when we talk about biodiversity threat, this is the sort of integrated perspective from these 23 different stressors. what's at stake, the thing that we care about in this case, is aquatic biodiversity. So we're referring to these hundreds of thousands of species of animals and plants that you find in rivers around the world. They're supporting all kinds of vital services to human societies, purifying our waters, supporting fisheries, et cetera, reducing toxic algal blooms. There are lots of reasons we want to conserve biodiversity, and so we're concerned about the way that all of these threats work together to threaten or to sort of undercut the biodiversity of the world's rivers.
Let's go now look at another one, which is HWS, standing for Human Water Safety Threat. So the same, blue is good, red is bad.
Exactly. So you don't want to live in a red area. So one of the things that is important to point out about this figure is this is the adjusted human water security threat. And what that means is we've taken the basic analysis that was similar to the biodiversity analysis we looked at a moment ago, and now we've adjusted those values to account for societal investments in water resource management. So increasing the accessibility of water, purifying water before it's used by people, things like that. So we start with a base map for human water security threats. It actually looks a lot like the biodiversity threat base map. But after we account for these investments, and I want to emphasize that these are huge societal investments, trillions of dollars a year globally, those investments can offset the threat levels and enhance water security for human populations. So this is the perspective that you're seeing now, where now the US doesn't look so bad, right? Now we're kind of middle of the spectrum or even above average in terms of water security. Whereas if you'd seen the unadjusted one, we're in the worst 20% in the world.
So that's an interesting point. Let's talk about that a little bit more. One of the points you make in the article is the problems are just as bad, which may be surprising to people, in developed countries versus lesser developed countries. But the developed countries have solved the problem by engineering it or, less fancy, spending money on it.
Exactly.
So doesn't that mean, okay, they solved it? And you say, no, it's not.
So the trick is we've solved it for the moment. And so what the threats we're talking about, these are long-term issues. So the history for over a century in the US and Western Europe is to make these investments in technology. And in essence, we've gotten really good at using these engineering approaches, a high-tech approach, to putting to rest what you might call the symptom set. We're not solving the problem, we're just alleviating the symptoms. And so that's not sustainable in the long term. It costs us a fortune today and in perpetuity. And we haven't actually solved the problem. So it's great that we can go home at night and we've got all the clean water that we could ever drink or bathe with or what have you. We're lucky to have access to that kind of water security here in the US, but it's not because there aren't threats. That's the issue.
So we'll continue our discussion. We're going to look at one more map. So please stay with us. We're with Peter McIntyre, Assistant Professor, Center for Limnology, University of Wisconsin-Madison. Stay with us on Office Hours.
Great People is our campaign for need-based scholarship aid. It's the key to the long-term well-being of the university as a whole.
In 1970, tuition cost about $500.
Today, it's about $9,000.
We don't want UW-Madison to be a university that is deemed to be out of reach.
The Great People Scholarship gives students a chance to succeed in life.
Support the Great People Scholarship. Visit uwgreatpeople.org.
Welcome back to Office Hours. I'm Ken Goldstein, and joining me today is Peter McIntyre, Assistant Professor, the Center for Limnology, University of Wisconsin-Madison. So, Pete, we're going to go to another one of these maps, which is, I think, combining the first two maps. So Let's go to that and have you take us through that.
All right, so Ken, this is the dual perspective. So this is now basically asking, are we above average or below average for biodiversity threats and for the adjusted human water security threats? So if you're in an area of the world that's red, it means you have above average threat levels for both biodiversity and adjusted human water security. If you're yellow, like most of North America, then you have above average scores for biodiversity, but below average scores for human water security. And so basically, most of what you see on this map, although there are some other colors, is mostly either yellow or red. So if you look at India, or you look at eastern China, most of equatorial Africa, those areas are all red. These are regions where a huge proportion of the world's population is found, and you have very high threats to both biodiversity and adjusted human water security. And what the adjusted means here, it's actually very important. It means that the investments in protecting human water security are not very high. They're not offsetting these sort of fundamental threat levels. So if you now look at Western Europe or at North America, those areas are almost entirely yellow. That means biodiversity is in bad shape, but it means that we've managed to alleviate the threats to human water security through investments.
Okay, so let's follow up on a couple points here. So as you look at the map, it doesn't look like there's tremendous amounts of red, but a lot of that red is populated in places where there's tons of people, India and China, for example, and equatorial Africa. Yep. So that's an issue. And again, as you look at places like United States and North America, you know, again, let me come back to this question. So there's issues with biodiversity, but we're engineering around it. So we fixed it.
We fixed it from a human water security perspective. So the reason that when we looked at the maps, we just show biodiversity threat, there's no adjusted biodiversity threat, is when we fix things for human water security, we almost always are further imperiling aquatic biodiversity.
So how might you fix things for human water safety?
Which
could hurt in terms of biodiversity?
Well, so there's a win-win strategy, our team would argue, which is that by protecting watersheds, and this is really exemplified by the New York City watershed and their actions over the last few decades in the upper Hudson in the Catskill Mountains of New York. So a few decades ago, the city of New York, huge population by our US standards, faced a really fundamental decision. Do we invest a huge amount of money in building more and more and more treatment plants and purification plants in order to protect the water supply for the city of New York? Or instead, do we try to rely more on the natural purification processes that occur in all rivers around the world? And those are essentially free. We call them ecosystem services. They're free to us, they're provided by ecosystems, and they benefit humanity. And so, but in order to maintain those services, you have to protect the watershed. So basically, they kept forest where forest belongs, and they protected wetlands and floodplains. And simply by protecting those habitats, which wasn't absolutely free, but the costs were very, very low compared to investing in more wastewater treatment plants and more drinking water purification plants, they've managed to maintain a very high level of water purity for the city of New York at much, much lower cost than they had chosen the technological road, the purely technological road. It's not that we can do without drinking water purification plants in modern society. The reality is there are just too many chemicals in the water, so we really need those things. But if we rely entirely upon that and basically modify river systems to the point where they can no longer buffer us against floods, provide sustainable fisheries, and purify the water, then we're really stuck if we reach a point where we can't engineer ourselves out of things. So our fundamental argument is it's cheaper and it's more sustainable to rely on these natural services.
And when we come back, I want to talk about more of the sorts of things that folks in the United States can do in general and worldwide. So please stay with us on Office Hours with Pete McIntyre talking about the health of the world's rivers.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Hi, welcome back to Office Hours here with Peter McIntyre from the Center of Limnology, University of Wisconsin-Madison. So, Pete, we were talking about what New York has done. When I looked at that map, there seemed to be a lot of red around here in the Midwest on the biodiversity threats. Yep. What's going on here in the upper Midwest?
So again, all that red was that's sort of the summation of these 23 different kinds of stressors. So major issues in the Midwest would include dams, agricultural runoff, sediment problems, So we're not an area where overfishing is a big problem, where aquaculture is causing any problems. We do have a lot of invasive species. Everybody's probably heard about the Asian carp. That's just the most recent in a long, long list of invasives. So those are the major issues, sort of land use patterns, the associated chemical pollution. We have a big problem with coal-fired power plants. That's where we get most of our power here in the Midwest. And so that's a major issue, creating mercury that goes into the atmosphere and then comes down in the rain and pollutes our fish.
So your ability to do this study in 5 more years, because I imagine not only because you get 2 journal articles at it, right, but it'll be interesting to see the change over time and those maps to be able to see change. Are you going to have the ability to do that? And do we have the ability to continue to monitor these sorts of things?
So there are some big challenges. Our team definitely wants to continue to look into the future. So everything that we talked about to date, this is sort of the current state assessment. We haven't yet projected into the future with climate change, with population growth, with shifts in where people are living. But another really big problem that we face, Ken, is that in the mid-'80s compared to today, we actually knew more about how much water was flowing out of the world's rivers then than we do now. And that's a fairly simple fact from cutbacks in government monitoring programs, from privatization in much of the world of the operation of dams or other monitoring stations. And so it's really unfortunate because water is the most essential of natural resources, and yet rivers, which are supply sustainable fresh water to more people than any other source, if we're losing the basic ability to know what's going on with the amount of water in rivers, let alone all these more complex things we're talking about, it really doesn't bode well for our being able to even assess what the conditions are, let alone project into the future. So that's a real issue.
So we're just about a minute left here, but so just the amount. So I'm thinking you'd say the problem was we couldn't measure what's in it, but why is knowing how much there is an issue?
So you can imagine, if I had this cup and I added a chemical that has a dye to the cup, how much water was in the cup initially, that dictates how much I can dilute out the pollution. That's the fundamental issue with flow with regard to chemical pollution. Of course, biodiversity relies on having natural flood cycles and enough water to keep the temperatures low, et cetera. So there are lots of reasons we care about the amount of water in the systems, from dilution to just maintaining basic habitat for animals.
Great. Peter, thanks so much for having us, for joining us, and here on Office Hours, and hope you'll come by again. Very interesting.
Thank you, Ken.
Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Don't forget, Office Hours is on the web via our university website, Facebook, or even Twitter. Take a look and let us know your thoughts. From the University of Wisconsin-Madison, this has been Office Hours. Thanks for stopping by.
The preceding program was produced by the University of Wisconsin in association with the Big Ten Network.